Good afternoon. Hi. My name's Tony Cascardi. I'm the director at the Townsend Center for the Humanities, and it's a great pleasure to see all of you here this afternoon for what is, in fact, the last of a series of events this year in the Forum on the Humanities and the Public World. For those of you who have attended other events in the series, you know, and for those of you who haven't, I'll say now, that the idea of the series is to bring prominent humanists, intellectuals, individuals from the performing arts and various spheres of life to address issues that bear on the relevance of the humanities to the public world in the local context, the national, transnational, and indeed the global context. And it's a great pleasure to welcome this afternoon Homi Bhabha to deliver this address. Homi Bhabha is the Anne F. Rothenberg Professor of English and American Language and Literatures and the director of the Humanities Center at Harvard University, where he's been since 2001. I know he's well known to many of you, both personally, from individual dialogues, talks, and encounters, and widely through his books. He's had a very distinguished teaching career, including appointments in the Department of English at Sussex, as Old Dominion professor at Princeton University, as Steinberg visiting professor at the University of Pennsylvania, as Chester D. Tripp professor in the humanities at the University of Chicago, as a faculty member in the School of Criticism and Theory when it was at Dartmouth, and on and on and on. And I promised that I would make it a relatively brief introduction, mostly so that we can move on as quickly as possible to the talk. His many distinctions and prestigious appointments have been generated by a body of work that has been truly transformative for the humanities. We can track a number of the most important changes in our disciplines by two of his seminal works, Nation and Narration, an edited volume which was comprised very markedly under his influence and direction, and then following that, The Location of Culture. His work challenges the tendency to treat post-colonial countries as a homogeneous bloc. It resists facile assumptions that there is and was a shared identity among ex-colonial states. And he shows that it's far better to concentrate on the relationships of antagonism and ambivalence between colonizers and the colonized in what is, in the end, a remarkably diverse and complex terrain. It has been said that his work in postcolonial theory owes much to post-structuralism. This is no doubt true, but also inadequate. Count among his influences Derrida, Foucault, Lacan, and especially Edward Said, but in the end, it is an original and new amalgam and the advancement of post-structuralism into the field of postcolonial studies that is the genuine achievement of his work. And it is this enterprise that has served as the model for so many younger scholars in the humanities today. Homi Bhabha's work advances a fundamental realignment of the methodologies of cultural analysis in the West. He draws us away from metaphysical and other binaries and toward the awareness of the enunciatory power in shaping history. Once our perspectives and imbrication in binaries are reformed and reframed, cultures can be understood as interacting, transgressing, and transforming each other in a far more complex way. His work shows all this and so much more. I suspect that his talk this afternoon will have something substantial to say about all these many things. His topic is On Global Memory, Thoughts on the Barbaric Transmission of Culture. Please welcome Homi Bhabha.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. If you didn't live in such an extravagantly beautiful place with such fantastic weather, if you lived where I lived, you wouldn't be here. I thank you very much for giving up an afternoon, a Friday afternoon, to be here. Now, I want to thank Professor Tony Cascardi, who has been remarkably generous to me. We've been trying to set this date for a while. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much, Tony. And to the assistant of the center, assistant director of the center, Teresa Stoikov. Teresa, thank you very much for all your help. And indeed, for the help of the others who work in the center, I'm most grateful. The wonderful thing about going to give talks is that you get to know everybody, from your friends to the entire administrative structure of many institutions, and you appreciate how much is actually done, as it were, behind the faculty lines. And I thank you all for being here very much today. Now, confronted with a crowd like this on an afternoon, I think I should have been much more entertaining than I'm going to be. I should have clearly followed the habits of consumer capitalism and produced for you some charming and delightful things that you could snatch off the supermarket shelf. Unfortunately, I worked a little too hard, and I think I'm going to have to work you a little hard. But like most of the charming captains that we have these days, I shall tell you when to fasten your seatbelts and get through the turbulent areas of theory. Because, of course, after all, one of the things that I have been honored to be known for is not to be understood widely. An honor I have also shared with a wonderful friend I have at this university. But let me just give you a roadmap of what I'm going to do today. This talk really is about cultural memory and cultural heritage. And the text, I don't want to sound as if I'm speaking from the pulpit in church, but the text for the day is something you all know very well, and some of you in this room know much better than I do. There is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism, and just as a document is not free of barbarism, barbarism also taints the manner in which it was transmitted from one owner to the other. And this became for me very suggestive over the last few years, when I kept thinking, what will we transmit of the barbarism in which we are involved now? How do we transmit that barbarism? What will happen? And what does Walter Benjamin mean, these lines, as you are well aware of from the thesis on history, what does he mean when he talks about the document being that barbarism taints the manner in which it was transmitted from one owner to the other? What is this form of transmission? How do you transmit barbarism? What does it mean to be able to transmit barbarism without being taken over by it? But in fact, in order to transmit it, you have to reproduce it. Trauma is not simply something that howls from a distance, but it's something that has to be reconstituted and dealt with. And models of repression and working through are not entirely adequate. So I've tried to confront this problem for you and with you today. I start off then by looking at what I see as the contemporary messianic moment in contemporary politics. And I do that by looking back at T.S. Eliot, who I see as a messianic modernist, who I see as a poet who was as much involved in a kind of imperial civilizing or civilizational mission as he was in a mission of the soul. And I suggest that there are certain ways in which contemporary messianic thinking, contemporary thinking around fundamentalism might actually not be the same as, no, I never said that T.S. Eliot was a jihadi, but I'm suggesting that there are actual elements in this founding text, these founding texts of our education in literature, in English and American literature, that might actually help us to think about the messianic in our contemporary moment. I then turn to the question of messianic memory in Walter Benjamin. Actually, I downplay the messianic side and I try to think about memory and temporality and the question of translation in Walter Benjamin, particularly in this coupling of barbarism and civilization and the way in which transmission takes place. And I actually have not found that much on the question of transmission, although I've spoken to many Benjamin scholars about this. So I've tried to put together something about transmission as a form of translation, close to Benjamin. And that, in a way, helps you to think about the way in which trauma and barbarism finds each time what Benjamin calls the recognition of the now, a different present. And that will be the second move. Then I will talk a little bit about an experience I myself had when I was subject to this kind of ambivalent, agonistic struggle of barbarism and civilization in relation to cultural heritage. I look at Hannah Arendt and end with the work of a non-nationalist Palestinian artist. Maybe I'm simplifying it by saying she's not a nationalist. I don't think she is, but who's very committed to the cause and yet is a diasporic artist who takes the elements of a kind of barbaric memory and turns it into, I believe, something quite pleasant. Something quite prescient and something very important. No, there isn't anything very pleasant today. The pleasant is outside. Inside here, there's nothing very pleasant. But I thank you for being here, and I look forward to your questions. The skies are strafed with flares of messianic messages and false dawns. The air is thick with the fog of war, the dust of collateral damage, the airbrush abused of Abu Ghraib, heaped and mangled in their indignity, victims of a technique of terror that the military police interrogation manual calls pride and ego down. After all, we're at war, endless war, and war is hell in our digital hall of mirrors. The pictures aren't going to go away. These were Susan Sontag's last words. Here they say the war will never end. Elsewhere in the killing fields of Iraq, the rules are grab whom you must, do what you want. One US intelligence officer said to Seymour Hersh, "We're not going to read more people than necessary into our heart of darkness." Joseph Conrad has become an exemplary witness of our times, mentioned again and again in the New York Times and elsewhere, and his great novel, Heart of Darkness, is, in a way, a fable of the terror and agony in which we live. But what kind of time is this? This present of endless terror and trauma at many distances from the event. Traumatism is produced by the future, by the to come, by the threat of the worst to come, rather than by an aggression. These were Jacques Derrida's words on 9/11, not long before he died. And in the midst of this montage of traumatic words and times and events, of this unbearability of endlessness, I cannot stop hearing the song of the thrush from Eliots' Burnt Norton. "Go, go," said the bird. "Humankind cannot bear very much reality. Time past and time future, what might have been and what has been, point to one end, which is always present." Eliots' Burnt Norton is renowned for its metaphysical and spiritual meditations on the still point of the turning world. The poet awakened by the bird follows the via sanctiva of Buddha, St. John of the Cross, the Bhagavad Gita, the idealist monism of F.H. Bradley. In his own melancholic and Mandarin way, Eliot was also profoundly engaged with the turning world itself, a world turned, as he wrote, inside out by wars. War, in Eliot's verse, is a metaphor of spiritual and psychic struggle, the inner freedom and the practical desire, as he put it. But in the mid-30s, and Burnt Norton was published in 36, Europe was a theater of fascist and anti-fascist wars. The Spanish Civil War, the Italo-Ethiopian War, the German reoccupation of the Rhineland. If war for Eliot is a metaphor for the messianic struggle of the soul, liberation for the future as well as the past in his words, then war is also a metaphor for a civilizational struggle to preserve and transmit the hieratic values of an elite classical culture committed to the maintenance of a cultural hegemony on a global scale. The aesthetic scale of Eliot's concept of the classic is deeply embedded in the extensive geopolitical scale of an imperial culture, be it Rome or Britain. Liberty is good, Eliot writes with sympathy for Machiavelli, but more important is order. Order in this context must be understood as something more than the regulatory force of political power. Order here also signifies the representational authority of a classical civilizational and culturalist genealogy that struggles to establish the global preeminence of certain Eurocentric cultural, ethical, and aesthetic values as, and I quote Eliot again, an empire and a language with a unique destiny in relation to ourselves. Despite the fact that What is a Classic was written in 1944, during the darkest nights of European barbarism, Eliot kept faith with that unique destiny and extended it beyond the ourselves of the European Christian domain, amongst which the Jews largely did not count, to assert for its centrality in establishing nothing less than a world order. For we need to remind ourselves, he wrote, that Europe is a whole, and still in its progressive mutilation and disfigurement, that organism out of which any greater world harmony must develop. And I think the period which he wrote this and the moment in which he wrote this is as important as what he says. From the wasteland to the four quartets, wartime, I believe, is more than a historical event, although Eliot isn't preeminently known to be a war poet. I think there's time for a kind of revision of Eliot's estimation as a war poet. It is a framing and historical, wartime is a framing and historical temporality that provides Eliot with a poetic language of metaphoric translation and transformation. And as his civilizational crusade is translated into the language of fiery spiritual transcendence, we begin to discern at once the important entanglement of the war of nations and the war of souls. It is this entanglement of aims that shapes Eliot's apocalyptic, messianic tone, which resonates with the spiritual cultural aspirations of some of the fundamentalist, culturally internationalist and spiritually internationalist, religiously internationalist trends of our own times. This is, for instance, true, as Faisal Devji writes in his excellent book, Landscapes of the Jihad, of a jihadi messianic vision of the future, which in those terms is the caliphate. As much a metaphysical category as a political vision, the caliphate's role allows the jihad to abandon the political geography of the Cold War, writes Faisal Devji, made up of national states, for a completely deterritorialized space, since the caliphate, imagined by the jihad, possesses neither center nor periphery. End of his quotation. And it is no less true of the evangelical messianism that structures unilateralist preemptive action which is a central tenet of American foreign policy and can be heard in the prophetic tones of George W. Bush's second inaugural address when he asserted that America's ultimate goal is ending tyranny in the world and suggested that the perfection of an imperfect world should better be left to God. Eliot's poetic ideas and ideals give us an insight into the fervid ascending scale of affective values that can transform a fierce regionalist or nationalist affiliation into a deterritorial, metaphysical aspiration to global cultural sovereignty. What starts as the expression in Eliot of amor patriae, the passionate identification with a cultural territorial location and tradition, love of a country as attachment to our own field of action, is followed by a temporal anxiety fueled by a sense of the loss of civilizational order and historic sovereignty. History may be servitude, history may be freedom, after which comes the apocalyptic vision of holy terror that signifies the realization of divine justice, even when it defies the secular representation of that state of being. The dove descending breaks the air with flame of incandescent terror. The only hope or else despair lies in the choice of pyre or pyre, to be redeemed from fire by fire. Even more pertinent to the geopolitical problems we face today on a transnational scale are the following lines that explore the complex sublimatory relationship between social anxiety and pious perplexity. When there is distress of nations and perplexity, whether on the shores of Asia or in the Edgware Road, men's curiosity searches past and future and clings to that historic dimension, but to apprehend the point of intersection of the timeless with time is an occupation for the saint. Eliot's messianic mission, carried out in the name of holy fire and an incandescent civilizational order, speaks to the messianic conflicts and concepts of our own times. Conrad and Dostoevsky are now continually referred to as proximate to our predicament. In terms of the themes and dilemmas that preoccupy both writers, there is a useful argument to be made in that direction. But Eliot understands the modernity of the messianic spirit better than either of them. In the space of a few verses, through the efficacy of voice and meter and image, Eliot enables us to inhabit and experience the temporal rhythm of a messianic history, whether or not we identify with its ideas or accept its ideologies. Eliot would have himself had little difficulty in embracing the form, if not the content, of an idea like the caliphate. More a metaphysical category than a political vision, the caliphate's role allows the jihad to abandon the political geography and create a new cultural and spiritual whole. And even though Eliot would have found George W. Bush impossibly lowbrow and low church, there was a kind of down-home Eliotism in what has been described frequently as his messianic tone. Having said this, in Four Quartets, we also experience a sudden, surprising shift. There are moments when Eliot lifts his messianic drape, the intolerable shirt of flame which human power cannot remove, in order to reveal the historic human body marked by the instruments of war, traumatized by violence. The trilling wire in the blood sings below the inveterate scars appeasing long-forgotten wars. Of what does the blood sing as it flows beneath the inveterate scars? We recall the warbling of the thrush that trills in the human soul. Go, 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 said the bird. Humankind cannot bear much reality. But the trilling wire is an instrument of a darker reality. For to trill is not merely to sing, it is also to twist, to turn, to revolve, to rotate, as if the scarred body of torqued flesh, like a figure by the artist Francis Bacon, is a tortured and disfigured icon of the turning world. Inveterate scars, long-forgotten wars, scars and wars, echoing end rhymes, bring back each other to life in the memory of defilement and death, ensuring that no violence is lost to memory, no terror forgotten by human history. It is this thread in Eliot's messianic thinking that I want to use now as a transition to my next point. The trilling wire, the inveterate scars, are themselves in the practice of appeasement. But appeasement is never a sign of peace. It is at best a form of pacification. The trilling wire, I believe, are like what Benjamin called small crystals of the total event, and create a contemporary constellation of images in which, as Benjamin writes of the montage of dialectical imaging in the Arcades project, and I quote him, every present day is determined by the images that are synchronic with it. Each now is the now of a particular recognizability. The now of Jean Améry comes to mind, Améry who recounts the ever-present image of the tortured body in the concentration camps. I quote from Améry. Torture, from Latin torcere, to twist. What visual instruction, he writes in etymology. Whoever was tortured stays tortured. 22 years later, I am still dangling over the ground by dislocated arms, panting and accusing myself. In such an instance, there is no repression. Does one repress an unsightly birthmark? The sign that is transplanted in its place is not the skin with which one feels naturally at ease. In this context of these particular nows of the trilling blood in the body, I want to recall the now of Sattar Jabbar, the wire-hooded figure of Abu Ghraib, whom the Iraqis call the Statue of Liberty, but the world of the internet has named Bruegel's Angel of Death after his painting, The Triumph of Death. And then the now of a particular recognizability, of a particular history, of the 17-year-old Tutsi seamstress, Jeannette Ayinkamie from Nyamata in Rwanda, who in summing up her own experience draws a hideous conclusion about the world's history. I now know, she says, that a man can become of an incredible wickedness very suddenly. I do not believe that genocides have ended. I do not believe that those who say that we have reached the depths of atrocity for the last time speak the truth. When there has been one genocide in one village, there can be another one at any moment in the future, in any place, in Rwanda or elsewhere, if the cause is still there and we do not know what it is. the now that synchronizes Jean-Baptiste Munyankore's image of an ever-present day in Rwanda, once and every day. What happened in Nyamata and the churches, he says, in the marshes and the hills are the supernatural doings of ordinary people. A priest, the magistrate, the assistant chief of police, a doctor killed with their own hands. These learned people were calm, and they rolled up their sleeves to get a firm grip on the machete. So for people like me, who have taught the humanities their life long, criminals such as these are a terrible mystery. What do we make of the suddenness, the terrible mystery of this iterative and insistent now that is the moment that Benjamin might describe as a telescoping of the past through the present? What do these testamentary nows bring back, and how do they bring it back? What does this now mean when we said, instead of those nows, never again? What comes to light in this now of recognizability, Benjamin's phrase, that interrupts and interrogates the long history, the once upon a time of the Rwandan past? We know about the unforgiving tryst of terror and locality that resulted in the brutal hacking of neighbors and friends, founded on a complex history of indigenism and racialism that defined the political identities of Hutu and Tutsis for over 50 to 100 years. Within 6 weeks, 5 out of 6 Tutsis had been killed. We know those histories. Jeanette knows that history, and yet there is something about the return of this presentness, about this moment that returns and recurs, and as she says, having provided us with the historical narrative that would explain in historical and sociological, even moral and political terms, what happened, she says, somehow something returns for which there is no, which seemingly has no cause and no explanation. What comes to mind immediately in Jean-Baptiste's description of members of the caring pastoral professions rolling up their sleeves to better grip their machetes, or Jean Améry's equally vivid image of the torturer at Brindonk establishing the spirit of his fellow man and then returning to a quiet breakfast in the company of the world as will and representation, is Walter Benjamin's observation on the historian's doleful destiny, which comes to the fore when he reflects on the provenance of cultural treasures. There is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. And just as such a document is not free of barbarism, barbarism also taints the manner in which it was transmitted from one owner to another. And unconventional as the reading might be, Eliot, in 45, suggesting that despite the disfigurement of the European or Eurocentric, not European, but Eurocentric classical ideal, it was in and through that a new harmonious world order would come, is yet another moment when barbarism and civilization make uncomfortable and unhappy bedfellows. In choosing to brush this thought, as he says, against the grain, Benjamin raises for me a question begged by the sudden eruption, he would call it a blast, a flash, an explosion of this now time, a problem posed by images at a standstill, the twisted, trilling body of the tortured, the doctor's caring hand preparing itself for the machete. The question for me is, doesn't this transmission of the barbaric or traumatic past, for witness and victim alive, have a debt to the ethics of memory, which is committed, and I quote Benjamin, to exploding the homogeneity of the epoch interspersing it with ruins, that is, with the present. And it is in, of course, in the midst of these ruins that the barbarism is both contained, and it is amongst these ruins that the barbarism haunts. Quite apart from the unconscious repetitions of the traumatic kernel, Benjamin opens up an enunciative space for the transmission of barbarism that has a liminal existence, somewhere in between the insistence of the unconscious of trauma and the institution of a narrative and historical consciousness. And this interstitial space of articulation or transmission becomes visible in what he calls a figural relationship, not between the past and the present, which he sees as being the kind of justificatory narrative of historicist progress, but between a reconstituted relationship, a relationship reconstituted from the ruins of the present, between what has been and the now, that I elicited for you from a range of contemporary political barbaric events. Benjamin writes, is awakening perhaps the synthesis of dream consciousness as thesis and waking consciousness as antithesis? Then the moment of awakening would be the now of recognizability, in which things put on their true surrealist face. If the afterlife of barbarism defies repression and outlives the processes of working through, then how do we account for its now of recognizability, which must provide, in its re-emergence, a sign or signal of the barbaric event, while dissipating the semblance of sameness? What comes back each time as the now, what came back in each of those testimonies, was not simply the event as it had happened, but the event as it was in the present, reconstituting the present itself. My interest in this practice of what I'm calling barbaric transmission was immensely sharpened by two perspectives on the afterlife of trauma. Martin Jay's essay, Walter Benjamin, Remembrance in the First World War, and a short piece by the filmmaker Claude Lanzmann titled The Obscenity of Understanding. Jay's refusal to let Benjamin's sadness be sublimated into a holistic, healing dialectic emphasized Benjamin's intolerance of culture's affirmative mode and raised for me the question of what it would mean for the now of cultural transmission to be retooled by the provenance of barbarism. Not simply the same barbarism, not a resemblance of that barbarism, but a barbarism each time made different, but each time repeated, as I said, precisely in the place where we thought instead of saying now, we would say never or never again. Jay writes, and I quote him, Benjamin refused to seek some sort of new symbolic equilibrium through a process of collective mourning that would successfully work through the grief, thus the seemingly paradoxical call in his Dostoevsky essay for an unforgettable immortal life that is nonetheless without monument, without memory. Steadfastly anti-Hegelian, he protested against a notion of memory as a remembering of what had been dismembered, I'm sorry, we changed programs this morning, and the word has now disappeared. Anamnestic totalization of the detotalized. We had a problem this morning when I had a new program and it wouldn't print out, so we had to take out. So I'm reading words that now look even more German than they were, because they're all, many of them, I hope I have overcome this in my delivery, because many of my words in my text are all glued together into this anamnestic totalization of the detotalized. Who needs to learn German? All you need is to get a program that doesn't print out. Scornfully rejecting, so let me give Marty J., who is here, and I'm honored to have him, because in fact this idea of holding on to the barbarism was something I was very heartened when I came upon that essay, and I thought it was actually working in many ways in the same direction. So let me give him his eloquent, Germanized, English, American voice. Steadfastly anti, I'm going to try this again once more, only once again, I'm playing it once again for you, Marty. Steadfastly anti-Hegelian, he protested against, wish me well, a notion of memory as a remembering of what has been dismembered, as an anamnestic totalization of the detotalized, scornfully rejecting the ways in which culture, at least in its affirmative mode, can function to cushion the blows of trauma. He wanted to compel his readers, Jay concludes, to face squarely what had happened and confront its deepest sources, rather than let the wounds scar over. If Jay's phrase, the wounds scar over, echoes Ameri's daily discomfort with his scarred skin, that is not the skin with which one feels naturally at ease, then Lanzmann telescopes the traumatic barbarism of the past into the now of transmission or mediation. But I repeat, Lanzmann says, talking of his film Shoah, that the real problem is to transmit. Although I think there is no real knowledge before transmission, it is difficult to say, it is difficult to explain, it is difficult to understand. I did not try to add new things to the knowledge or the documentation that we now have. But in spite of this, what was really important to me, what was at stake, was precisely this transmission. Again, you see here what is so interesting. It's not the newness of the knowledge. It's almost as if it's not the proposition of even what happened. When in Rwanda people say, we can't describe it. After many genocides, you get this, we can't describe it. We don't know what happened. It's not that it is the unconscious inarticulacy of trauma, although that exists. It is the conscious production of a form of speech, which at one level knows exactly the history, has the cause and explanation, but at another level almost cannot articulate it. It's almost as if not the proposition, but the positionality, the space of enunciation resists making that statement. It's at that level. It's at the level of enunciation. I think this is also actually true in Agamben's work on witnessing. What I at least find most interesting about it is not what is most often cited or quoted, but the way in which he sees the problem of witnessing as a problem of enunciation, not of the énoncé, not of the proposition, but of the positionality of the subject in speech at that time. So when Lanzmann says, I didn't add anything that people didn't know, it's a question of producing a discourse, whether it is an expressive, phenomenological discourse or an analytic one, which actually stays with that moment of the now and its inarticulacy, which gives it a status, not an explanatory status, but an epistemological and also an ethical status. And that's why I gave you that series of now, following on from Eliot's much more delicate evasion of that very kind of moment. If barbaric transmission rejects, sorry, I have to go back. Although Lanzmann identifies Shoah's method of remembrance with Freud's concept of working through, I think there is something else at stake in his insistence that cinematic transition or translation is not new knowledge, but a kind of now knowledge of barbarism. Not a new knowledge, but a kind of now knowledge. Not a knowledge that simply reflects or repeats what has happened, but in its inarticulacy, in the way in which it creates a caesura in speech, the way in which it actually defies testimony, creates another temporality. And it's in that temporality, in that encrypted temporality which draws you in, which you have to actually then encode, that the great stain of barbarism and its transmission is created. It's not by somebody telling you the story of barbarism. It is the way in which the enunciative, the basic, most profound enunciative basis of language stops at that time and creates a caesura. And if you read the new introduction to Beloved by Toni Morrison, she makes a very similar point. She says, I don't want to give you that narrative. I want to throw you in there. I want to throw you into the caesura. I want to throw you into that now of what happened in Reconstruction in 124 Bluestone Road. If barbaric transmission rejects the progress and process of culture, as Jay rightly says, in its affirmative mode, then how does it compel us to confront the scarification of culture? Or do we simply run scared from history's traumas? There is in Benjamin's theory of the dialectical image the now of what he calls recognition rather than resemblance. So not the now that resembles the trauma, that gives you the story or the content which resembles the trauma, but creates an entirely new form of recognition of the trauma in the present as it makes its way in the ruins of articulation or enunciation. That's what he means at the now of recognition rather than resemblance, the reconstruction in the present, in the moment of the present, in the discourse of the present. There is a translational thread of expression that is not as apocalyptic as the language of blasting and splitting that he associates with history as a constellation of dangers. And yet translationality as a way of thinking about the now, as part of what I'm calling transmission, is unmistakably inscribed into the vocabulary of awakening and sudden emergence that Benjamin associates with the reconstitution of the moment of trauma, the now. It is in the present, Benjamin writes, and I quote, that historical evidence polarizes into fore and after history, always anew, never in the same way, never simply semblance, always recognition or recognition. And it does so at a distance from its own existence in the present instance itself. He continues, like a line which, divided according to the Apollonial section, experiences its partition from outside itself. Now, with all the scholarly controversy over what Benjamin could have meant by this Apollonian section, there's a long history of scholarship and scholarly disagreement about this, it is safe to say that this internally dividing line of history, which creates the sense of fore history and fore and after, both articulates and alienates the relation of the fore and after, is crucial to the construction of both what has been, the trauma as what has been, and the now. To experience or inscribe the internal partition of time and space, of event and its afterlife, as if from the outside, to quote Benjamin, is to open up a difference between recognition, the now which is always new, and the what has been. And the what has been now does not precede the present, but is a reconstruction of it after the recognition of the now. It's afterwards. So it's in a way, what happened before follows on and comes on after the recognition of its repetition, of its coming back again. Construction proposes destruction, Benjamin writes, and we now begin to see how this dividing line which constructs the fore and after history is something more than a timeline. It is the infusion of a deeply ambivalent cultural value into the passing of time. There is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism itself. It's because this line creates this dividing line, splits the present, it then creates the possibility of having on either side of it barbarism and civilization, not in a balance, but in a continual translational move. The now of barbaric transmission is only actualized, Benjamin writes, when a part of the past is touched by the present instance, but there must be no continuity between them. Again, his point that there should not simply be resemblance between trauma and what comes after, there has to be a recognition of it. And this part, he says, is, I believe, this part of the past, this small part of the past that must touch the present in order for the now to emerge. I believe this is at the heart of transmission, because very close to what Benjamin calls the process of translation. So recognition for him, the now of recognition, is a moment of translation. And as such, it is not a working through, it is not a repression, but it is the ability to recreate through translation, and through translation at the level of enunciation, the linguistic and discursive and philosophical moment, phenomenological moment of the trauma yet again. The life of memory exceeds the historic event by keeping alive the traces of images and words. Cultural memory, however, is only partially a mirror, cracked and encrusted, that sheds its light on the dark places of the present, waking a witness here, quickening a hidden fact there, bringing you face to face with that anxious and impossible temporality, the recognition of the now. Like a Mobius strip, memory does not merely transform the appearance of things. It changes, as Benjamin puts it, it displaces the angle of vision. It creates a new relation to the past in which the present and its ability to hold on and change the speed of progressive narrative creates a kind of confrontation with the past. My own experience of such a confrontation went like this. It was an unsettled, wet day in late May. The rain skidded across the windscreen, blinding us for a moment and then suddenly clearing away, giving us no hint of the kind of day we were to expect. My host, a German professor from Munich, suddenly suggested that we make a stop in Nuremberg. You must see Nuremberg, he said. I must take you there. Where, I stuttered, really meaning why. And then, of course, I quickly added, yes, certainly, what a good idea. I vaguely remembered, now quite embarrassed, a film about the Nuremberg trials, witness for the prosecution, seen as a child in Bombay, much before I knew anything about Albert Speer or the millions of Nazis who frequently gathered in what Hitler called the city of the rallies. Just these slight recollections, Hitler's high-pitched and heinous echolalia, and a tired phrase from Hannah Arendt, the banality of evil, trailed along in my mind as we drove off the Autobahn and after some innocuous suburban maneuvering, arrived at the Zeppelin, Hitler's massive parade ground. The vast stadium of soaring stone and empty crumbling terraces was almost soundless. Where hundreds of thousands once stood to rapturous, roaring attention, today in the rain, there was only a few of us, a man scraping the rust of his car, children baiting a dog, a few of us, tourists and visitors, at a loss for words, and what was far worse, without any sense of how to behave, where to look, what truism of history to utter. Nobody wanted to climb onto the pinnacle of the Zeppelin tribune to stand at the podium and assume Hitler's viewpoint from which he commanded the attention of his followers. Nobody pointed a camera at anything or anybody. There was no photograph to take home, no family group, no quick shot of the children at play in the field, now overgrown with weeds and grasses, its serried balconies chipped and bruised, its colonnades long since demolished. The site was neither background nor foreground. It was strangely there and nowhere. How do you dispossess a heritage site? How do you dispossess a site or subject of history that is at once that is at once a traumatic heritage of its memory. Guilt, reparation, apology, truth and reconciliation, these are important moral dispositions and political strategies that strive to surmount internecine violence in transitional historical moments with the virtue of public confession and collective introspection. But there is nothing in the ethic of ameliorative witnessing committed to fairness that prepares you for that vacuum, that now of recognizability that such monuments signify, the half-life of heritage, on the other side of which lies the death of culture. If nature hates a vacuum, history is even more repelled by it. And that repulsion is also a propulsion. You are drawn giddily into the vacuum and you spin out of it, thrown back upon yourself. What does it mean to be in close proximity to the half-life of heritage? As I stood in this place of barbaric transmission, Alexander Kluger's remarkable film, Brutality in Stone, passed before my eyes. Kluger explores the architectural tomb of the half-dead tribune, bringing back those voices, Hitler, Himmler, anonymous camp commandants that he had dug up from the Nazi archive. These dispossessed monuments and moments, the half-life of history, are also part of an intangible cultural heritage. Mortar and marbles have their own morals. They're intangible in a literal sense. It is difficult to be touched or moved by them, but they're also haunted by shame and anxiety and humiliation. At first I shrunk away from this site of dispossession, noli mi tangere, and then I realized that there was no way out of it. The half-life of heritage was mine, and only by embracing both possession and disposition could I construct a new angle of vision, a new site of enunciation. Hannah Arendt, and with her concept of the right to have rights, is actually one of the most significant thinkers in whose work brutality becomes the starting point for conceiving of an ethically sound political community. We became aware of the existence of the right to have rights, she writes, only when millions of people emerged who had lost and could not regain these rights because of the new global situation. There is, of course, a difference between Arendt's concept of the global situation and a global polity organized in terms of an equivalence of nation states and a contemporary notion of globalism that we experience. The relevance of Hannah Arendt's argument for my purposes today in thinking about barbarism and civilization lies in her insight into the global as a structure of internally divided contradiction and ambivalence. Arendt has been properly acknowledged for insisting on the importance of the political artifice of the public sphere for defining and defending what is human in human rights, rather than attaching the moral authority of rights to the abstract nakedness of being human. But what she says, for our purposes today, which is most significant, is that there is no outside, either ideological, political, or ethical, to the global system. Whatever alienates global interdependency or annihilates cosmopolitan values must be seen to be an effect of the internal dialectic, a demonic dialectic of the global condition itself. And I quote from her, "Deadly danger to any global civilization is no longer likely to come from without," Arendt writes. "The danger is that a global, universally interrelated civilization may produce barbarians from its own midst by forcing millions of people into conditions which, despite all appearances, are the conditions of savages." What kind of monstrous birthplace is this when barbarism emerges from the sack of civility and seeks succor at its own teats? I would like, as I end, to bring you to a moment of the recognition of recognition rather than remembrance in the work of Emily Yasir, the Palestinian photographer. In her work, there is a very complex relation of moral witnessing, one that seems to resonate with Avishai Margalet's question in his book, The Ethics of Memory, when he asks, is the moral witness a forward-looking creature even when his or her testimony is about the past? The beauty of Yasir's work is the way in which she rethinks memory, and she rethinks the ethics of memory. Her work, with its interleaving, its montage of similar photographs, she shows them as pairs. In fact, there's a video work where one shot is taken in Palestine and the other in New York, both of the Palestinian community who can't tell the difference of location. What is really brilliant in this montage that she stages is the history of memory and the history of trauma she poses, suggesting that the place of the ethical witness is somehow caught between a past that refuses to die, confronted by a future that will not wait to be born. It is in this kind of temporal disjunction that the moral witness is caught. In a region, then, that lies somewhere between a projective past of memory and a proleptic past of a kind of ethical future, between barbarism and civilization, the work of the New York-based Palestinian artist lives its own half-life of cultural heritage. Her work enacts a displacement of the angle of vision that links both diasporic and national histories. Can we have them on, please? Although committed to a national home for the Palestinians, she chooses not to subscribe to the potent communal myths of cultural authenticity that so often drive the exclusionary impulse in any nationalist movement. Yasir's account of her work interposes the space and time of the body as a bridge across these artificial islands, as she calls them, and borders that have been created. The two-video installation, Ramallah, New York, juxtaposes scenes of everyday Palestinian life shot in similar locations in Ramallah and New York. So careful is Yasir to place her figures as far as possible in the same position in the frame and to take the shot from virtually the same angle that it is difficult to tell apart the different locations of the various mise-en-scène. New York or not, Ramallah or not, it is almost impossible to answer these questions. Yasir's suggestion, can we have the next one? Can we have the next? Thanks. Oh, yeah, there it is. Yasir's suggestion is not, I believe, that Ramallah and New York are indistinguishable from each other. But what she is doing is very similar to the notion of the now of recognizability that Benjamin suggests. It is not the resemblance. It is not the resemblance that is important. It's not that it is not the fact that the two actually resemble each other. What is actually important to understand is how one is split between both sites and what that ambivalent positioning achieves. Yasir's montage of fungible locations and fragile bodies takes a more oblique view of the politics of everyday life. Her purpose in making it almost impossible to visually, at the level of resemblance, decipher the difference between the two locations, Ramallah and New York, is to induce an anxious undecidability in the frame of judgment and representation within the act of viewing. In trying to identify these geopolitical locations against the odds, the ruse of the title of the work is to acknowledge the specificity of sight while eliding visual resemblance. The viewer is split or doubled in trying to go beyond the resemblance to recognizing what is where. And in vacillating between frames, we actually begin to see what she's trying to do. If read from the perspective of displacement, the work sets out to relate to two scenarios to each other through a diasporic narrative of what she calls going back and forth. It is about passing rough places, about continual border crossings and continual cultural exchanges. In these seemingly settled scenes of quotidian activity, in the complete absorption of both hairdressers with their clients' hair, for instance, there is an unmistakable sense of disorientation rather than location. Once we realize that we will never know whether we are in Ramallah or New York. But in both places, we are dealing with the lives of exiles and refugees, of people who feel unhomed or not yet integrated into a national homeland. Yasir's emphasis on ordinary people and everyday scenes represents a complex artistic decision. She acknowledges the influence of Kawara on her work, and nobody who knows the everyday works, he paints every day a painting with the date. Nobody who knows that work will doubt that he, better than anyone else, understands what a difference a day makes. The date paintings that Kawara has been making for 40 years, each work made within the span of the single day whose date it shows, just as here there is an attempt to capture that one moment, that one gesture, that one spot of time, that one constellation at one time. We do not know for certain which of Yasir's scenes takes place in Ramallah and which in New York. But what we do learn from her montage is that the human measure of time is sustained by the body's daily wakefulness, its civic activities, its labor, its social relations, played out in both worlds. The inveterate scars and trauma of war still survive in the trilling blood. The clock of corporeality ticks away with a distinct rhythm and pace, back and forth, within history's louder tolling of the times of people and the trauma of countries. Yasir's focus on locality in Ramallah and New York does not neglect more global issues. There is a foreboding that without knowing exactly where you are, at any moment, on any day, no more than a minute after the video cam has recorded a person's life and its singular sediments, there could be a catastrophe that would forever maim the routine of human beings and families and peoples and cultures and communities. In one of these places, we don't know which, there lurks the epochal memory of 9/11. In another, there is the fear of disorder, violence, and violation. Yes, Yasir, I believe, brings my talk to its end. The photograph, a form that Benjamin described as being one that always represented that now of recognizability, the here and now, while actually taking you away into a much more infinite space of reflection, so that what is important is not, in a way, the mimetic resemblance, but the recognition as you move between them of how you take responsibility for both places and both times, for New York and for Ramallah. Our inability to distinguish between locations is, in fact, in some way, the basis of our global ethics, not necessarily in our continual demand for specificity, specificity, and specificity. It's the moving between and caring for both in different ways that I think is the basis of it. Through this movement, we commit ourselves to a double duty, to affiliate with the ethic of choosing to become involved with the historic fate, in this case, of both Ramallah and New York. It is therefore in our interest that we take a double stance. If we must step into the stream of time to feel the fast flow of progress and at times its cleansing, technic contemporaneity, we must also wade deep in the sewers of history, feeling the toe of the past and its traumas, the tug of the dark and the deep. And in the tension through which we move, hither and thither, there will emerge a current that sustains us and a currency of creative communication that may not save us, but will at least give us some chance to survive. Thank you. Thank you.
Just say thank you and then off some questions. So we may not have, I'll just pause a minute while we give people a chance to move about the room. And thank Homi Bhabha tremendously for this stimulating, wide-ranging, compelling, rich presentation. We may not have spent the hour in the bright sunshine, but certainly we have been nourished immensely by his talk. Before moving to questions, I also would like to announce that, as yet another example of his great generosity, at 4 o'clock, roughly, in 220 Stevens Hall in the Jabal Room, Homi Bhabha will be participating in a roundtable discussion led by Deniz Göktürk, the title of which is Where Europe Continues, Translingual Writers and the Cosmopolitan Imagination. And now we have a few minutes, 15 or 20 minutes or so, for questions. And I'm going to let Homi Bhabha just field them himself. I think that'd be best. But I want to open with a question of my own. If I might. You spoke so compellingly about trauma and the trauma of the yet again in the now, and so emphatically about this not being a matter of resemblance or of remembrance, but of recognition in this very complex way. At the same time, it struck me that there were two notions lurking somewhere on the edge of what you were saying, not quite introduced, that might have been, or maybe you'll tell us why not. And those were repetition and return. Do you have something to say about that?
Well, thank you, Tony. I did not want to go there because, in a way, time was short. And I felt that a lot of the work in this area has been done on the question of repetition with a difference, and then the whole, the psychoanalytic genealogy of that term, the death drive, and so on. I think, much has been done in that area. And because I was insisting so much on these reconstructed moments of the now, these moments that were not the now of the then. It was not. There was not that index of resemblance. I thought I wanted to take on what seems to me, and what I couldn't do as fully as I wanted to, although I wanted to put it out there, make the difference between resemblance and recognition. I wanted to draw that distinction out, and it took me, as you can tell, and while I was reading it, I realized that I was really leaning too heavily on your generosity, and I edited the paper even as I was speaking because I felt that I was asking almost too much. So I didn't want to go down that road of, the more conventional road of trauma studies, not because I don't agree with it, I agree with many bits of it, but I felt that it had been adequately addressed. Had I more time, what I was actually very keen to pick up on, and there's another section of this is obviously an abbreviated part of a longer talk, I wanted to talk about the affect of anxiety in the context of the difference between resemblance and recognition. That's what I wanted to do. Instead of going much more into the death drive and the return of repetition and the symptomatology of trauma, I would have wanted to do this. And the reason I took this route was because I wanted to draw attention really to the representation of trauma, and not to some exercise where in your writing you actually recreate the traumatic experience. You see what I'm saying? The referent was not so much the traumatic experience, but the representation of the traumatic experience in this kind of anxiety that produces the now. I know now, but you knew all along. But what do you know now? It's that moment that I want to draw attention. I think the larger issue is, for me, is this, that important though it is, and wildly important, that when we think in terms of conventions, when we think in terms of law, we have to think of an ameliorative process. We have to think in terms of making progress. Politically, historically, policy terms, legally, we have to run that narrative. The only responsible ethical narrative to run at the same time is that it will happen again. And it's a very difficult, it's easy to say, but it's a very difficult thing both conceptually to think this out. Narratively, it's easy, I can say it. But to think, in what temporality, what subject constitution, what enunciation, these more difficult questions, to think that the ethical as at one level, and to put it popularly, and the political are so diverse. We have to believe that it will happen again, which is a different kind of temporality to the idea that we must see that it never happens again. That's why I tried I don't know whether it worked or not, to rhetorically hold on to this now of recognition, which is not the now of resemblance, and showed this work, which allows you to be entirely committed to both places and both times, and to bring the barbarism, the pun with the barber there too, the barbarism and the civility and the civilization to think them together. You don't have to see the problem in order not to know the problem. And that's recognition, rather than having to see it. And I also feel, just one other thing, that there's been a lot of emphasis in the readings of that convolute N in the Arcades project, the epistemology thing, on surrealism and montage as a visual practice. And here, in an odd way, I was trying to show the visuals to think of it more as an inscriptive practice too. Please.
I hope I'm not oversimplifying your topic.
Your name?
My name's Irene. Hello. I'm trying to kind of come to grips with everything I've got. So it seems like there's a way you're talking about sort of mapping, this recognition of mapping events and locations, talking about the overlaps, the synthesis, drawing proximity. And I'm wondering if there's also a sense of something that's at risk or a danger in this as a strategy, and if you feel like that, what might be some of those risks or dangers in that strategy?
I think one of the risks might be, and this is a risk that, a risk that I'm willing to take, but a risk that a lot of people point out, that if you're actually very interested in this kind of splitting and ambivalence, which brings a kind of, as I said in the paper, both an articulation and an alienation at the same time, which I think is a leitmotif, is a very important thing. I think there is a sense in which people might say that if you're caught up in this, then where is the identification? Where can the commitment come from? And I chose especially a difficult example in the Yasir, because it would be one thing if you saw New York and then you saw Ramallah, and if you've been in Ramallah, it really is, as Benjamin said, the present in ruins in many different parts and for many reasons, and you saw both these things, then it would be much easier to talk about affiliation. But showing to me, the ambivalence does not mean that there is a passivity or there is an ambiguity about commitment. It only means that you are more committed. You have a commitment in excess. There is a double commitment. And that, of course, also has its problems. But I would go that way than into any of the more polarizing ways. That's why I made also, as I was talking, a slight change in the Benjamin, because he talks at times about the polarization of the before and after when he's talking about the historical moment. And I tried to negotiate my way away from that. The the fore and the afters of polarization, and tried to think about the way in which, as I suggested, that the what has been, because he makes a distinction, the past to the present, the shadow of the past does not simply fall on the present. All that more progressivist way he suggests is problematic, and I agree with him. So the way I worked it out was that in a way, the what has been follows on from the now. You know, it's the kind of future anterior of the now. It's not before the now. It's what gets constructed in and in relation to the now. So it's in a way counterintuitive that what went before comes afterwards. But that's why but that allows him to say wherever there is construction, there is also destruction, and that is not a deconstructionist move. I don't believe in his work. Please. Alexander, you're going to have to talk into a mic. I can hardly hear you. Come here. No, I didn't talk about, now I just said in conclusion, I did not actually, there was nothing of that progressivist mode or that mode of progression in the talk. What I said now was that it's impossible in some sense in the public domain not to write one's laws or not to write one's conventions, as indeed many conventions start by saying, you know, never again. And therefore, we've got to get beyond this. And of course, there are many things one can do institutionally. I'm just suggesting that there's a distinction there between what we can think institutionally and what we think in a way ethically, without that. And I agree with Jeanette that there is no way. I mean, as she says, you know, once this has happened, it will happen again. And it's difficult to think that you will avoid that. So all I'm saying is that one is in a very difficult position to hold both those ideas together. Now, that is not to say that we don't learn about situations of disaster and try and avoid them. Of course we do. But it seems to be on a longer scale. It is difficult not to say this will happen again. I mean, you know, I don't know how many of you people are here from South Asia, from India, you know. People said the post-independence riots, the moment of the freedom of India was also the moment of these great communal and religious riots. And, you know, they have happened again. And the interesting thing about the last set of riots was they happened exactly when market capitalization started in India, when the free market started. With that came a kind of nationalism rather than an internationalism, as one might have expected. And with them came the attacks in Gujarat, which were every bit as problematic as 1947-48. That's what I meant. Please.
I'll come up closer so you can hear me. I was wondering what kind of artifacts do you think this recognition can happen best? T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland is built out of references to literature, canonical literature, European, some American too, songs, but mainly literature. And much of your model, much to mine Adorno, I don't know if you mentioned Adorno in the beginning, I wasn't here in the beginning, talk about Benjamin.
I didn't know.
But Adorno posits the same moment of recognition of the utmost importance and the only source of hope. But for Adorno, it's in contemporary music. He looks for references to the flight of modernity in music throughout history, but especially in his own moment.
So for me, I mean, obviously literature is kind of home base, so I'm interested in that, and I was very interested when I read T.S. Eliot again. You know how this messianic struggle of the soul and the struggle of cultures and civilizations seem to me to come together, and you could begin to see that in the midst of this great formal, in a way, revolution in language, there is this messianic moment that speaks in many ways the current fundamentalist issues. So obviously literature to me is a very important site. I think film and cinema is an important site. The visual arts are very important for me, and I think certain philosophical writers. I think, and I treat those really as cultural documents or cultural artifacts too. These would be I'm a little tone deaf as far as music goes, but this is what.
Tropes in different traditions, being one. And the second one is the eternal return of barbarism. So my question is, on your point of view, is it your point of view that since barbarism is going to come back, we have to accept it, it's going to come back, so
no.
That's it? Or if that's not, then what would be the alternative narrative, or what would be the alternative, and when is it for us to decide to take that path or another path?
Well, those are two very good questions. I am interested in suggesting that the messianic return is not or the messianic response or the address is not always the same, but there's a kind of family likeness amongst some. That's why I used the Eliot where I did. It is, it's very difficult to. Yes, I do believe that how am I to put it? This switching between the one side of the civilizational and the barbaric, work very much together. And I don't think I can say, how does one avoid it? How does one avoid it? Other than to say that we are in a situation where, at one level, you create instruments to deal with it as much as you can, but at the other level, ethically, you have to have a different temporality, a different way of saying it will happen again. That's the issue. The point of decision depends upon the vigilance, the moral and ethical vigilance with which you track these movements. I mean, I here think of a line which I've from Adorno, from the essay on what does it mean to come to terms with the past, when Adorno says, he says, I'm much more, in the longer version of the paper I discuss it, I'm much more concerned with the sort of fascistic tendencies of social democracy than I am with the fascistic opponents of social democracy. Again, as I tried to say in the paper, it's what is happening on the inside. This is what Hannah Arendt's point to, that the barbarian isn't going to come from elsewhere. The barbarian is being produced from within. And there are many, of course, political and cultural forms of vigilance. But I think vigilance is the important thing. There's also one other issue. You can't predict, when is this going to happen, or did they know, in Gujarat, the night they went to bed before the event happened, that people were going to come and run rampant. There were of course a number of small incidents, but the now is actually very problematic and very difficult to establish whether the now is the moment of its happening or indeed the moment of its reconstitution. It's very difficult to get that. But it seems to me that the other thing I wanted to say was something that Bernard Williams once wrote in the line of ethical vigilance. It's in the book on ethics and the limits of philosophy, and I think a little bit in the book on shame, but he never developed, which was what he called ethical confidence. He said, and what you need for ethical confidence is the possibility of talking and discussing and writing and bringing in and researching and actually returning again and again to some of these complex issues for which there doesn't seem immediately to be a response or to be a plan. That it's only by confronting those things that feel contradictory and apparatic and paradoxical and ambivalent, by working alongside them or working with them, that you begin to slowly see where you may not go. You know, the ship of state cannot be turned around very quickly, as we know. So I think there is always that possibility too. And I like this term of ethical confidence, because he said, you know, at the ethical level, you can't just say to somebody, you know, what you're feeling is wrong. He said, but you can. There is a way of tilling the soil again and again, going back and in and through that process, creating a ethical vigilance and also an insight.
On that note, I want to thank Homi Bhabha again. I think and truly what we've seen is not just talk about ethical confidence, but indeed an enactment and a performance of it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.